You sit in a worn leather chair, the fire crackling softly beside you. In another age, a faint hum might have accompanied the silence, the tap-tap-tapping of a telegraph machine rhythmically marking time. It is the 1850s, and you are in the heart of the Australian outback. The nearest human is perhaps 50 miles away. You're not a gold miner or a lawman. You are something stranger, a telegraphist. The first lonely lines. In the early days of the Australian gold rush, the colonies were hungry not just for wealth, but for connection. Telegraph technology, already transforming communication across Europe and America, was hailed as nothing short of miraculous. News that once took weeks by horseback or sea could now be transmitted across vast deserts in minutes. And so came the overland telegraph line, a monumental and frankly mind-numbingly slow project that would link the southern city of Adelaide to the northern outpost of Darwin, and by extension, to London. This was more than 3,000 kilometers of wire through nothingness, Australia's spine, laced with copper. Yet the real story is not just the engineering. It's the people who man the line, especially those stationed at the in-between places. Station life, dust, ink, and insects. Telegraph stations weren't glamorous. Built of stone or timber, often hastily assembled by teams of workers in brutally dry conditions, these small outposts housed a team of 2 to 5 people. Their duties were repetitive, highly detailed, and incredibly isolating. The rooms were arranged efficiently: a sleeping chamber, a kitchen, a supply room, and the all-important telegraph room, where the clacking of Morse code messages became the heartbeat of the building. The instruments were meticulously maintained. Spools of copper wire, coils, relays, and dry cells were cleaned with care every morning. Any delay in relaying a message meant trouble for someone somewhere. Telegraphists kept detailed logbooks in meticulous handwriting. They recorded everything: message codes, sender and recipient locations, technical malfunctions, and weather patterns. You might wonder why weather. Because lightning was the enemy. A single storm could fry miles of wire. Meals without meaning. Food at the station was rationed and redundant. Damper, a heavy, flour-based bread, dried beef or mutton, canned peas a luxury, and gallons of black tea. Once a month a supply wagon might arrive, delivering fresh flour, sugar, tinned milk, and letters, although the latter rarely contained much more than brief notes from family or civil authorities. Salt was life. Without it, meat spoiled fast. Without meat, energy waned. Most stations had root cellars dug into the ground to preserve perishables. These spaces doubled as storm shelters and, in the summer, places to cool off, if only briefly. When the tapping stopped, breaks in the line were common, especially in the early years. Dingoes chewed the wooden posts, cattle broke wires, and in one well-documented case, a thunderstorm ignited a grass fire that burned 7 miles of telegraph cable. When a line failed, it was up to the nearest station to send out a lineman, usually on horseback, sometimes by camel. They carried leather tool belts, coils of wire, insulated gloves, and a small spade. The work was hot, often futile, and dangerous. Not only were there environmental hazards, heat stroke, bushfires, snakes, but there were human tensions too. Though largely overlooked by history, several Aboriginal groups saw the telegraph line as an intrusion, and rightly so. In some regions, this led to sabotage. Wires cut, poles felled. It was resistance through disruption. The government response: silent observation. Military detachments were not uncommon, and some stations eventually became semi-militarized. What had started as a quiet civil project was becoming a cold, humming frontier of empire. Sleeping in shifts. Telegraphists never truly slept. Messages could arrive at any hour, and because a delay could lead to errors or missed opportunities, especially for gold shipments or political communiques, the operators split the night into listening watches. Each man, or occasionally, woman, had to be alert during their shift, poised to decode at a moment's notice. Candles were rationed. Oil lamps were used sparingly. By necessity, they learned to work half-blind. Eyewear prescriptions were a common expense on resupply orders. Telegraphists often suffered early onset eye strain, and some went nearly blind before retirement. Boredom as burden. You might think that isolation would breed insanity, but for most telegraphists, the burden wasn't madness, it was sheer, relentless monotony. The same meals, the same tapping, the same wind. Some kept journals. One particularly poignant diary, recovered from the Peak Station ruins in South Australia, described in minute detail the act of watching ants dismantle a dead beetle over 3 days. The writer remarked, "They seem to have rules, but I know not what they are. Perhaps they vote." Other operators carved chess pieces from wood scraps, sending board positions to neighboring stations via Morse code, though this meant a single game could take weeks. Books were rare treasures, traded between stations with reverence. Dickens, Darwin, and a well-thumbed almanac were mainstays. More thrilling fair romance novels, penny dreadfuls were sent privately in brown paper wrapping. The sound of another voice. Despite the silence, telegraphists weren't alone. Through the wires, friendships formed. Men and women who never met in person spoke in clipped code for years. They developed in-jokes, shared weather updates, and passed on news from faraway towns. One such friendship, between an operator at Tennant Creek and another in Oodnadatta, lasted over 11 years. When the Tennant Creek operator died suddenly of fever, the final message was simply, "Line closed, he was my friend." The other station replied, "Understood, line will carry silence now." That message was recorded in the logbook and kept. Ghost wires and forgotten names. Today, much of the overland telegraph line is gone. Replaced by fiber optics and satellites, the poles have been pulled down, the wire recycled or rusted into oblivion. But the foundations of the stations remain, hidden under red sand or encased in historical plaques that no one reads. If you walk near one on a still day, some say you can hear a faint tapping in the wind. Not ghostly, not threatening, just rhythmic, purposeful, like someone somewhere is still sending a message. But what message would be so important it would echo through the years? That's where we end for now. You're standing inside a telegraph station again. Perhaps this time it's Barrow Creek, a desolate, fly-bitten building halfway between anywhere and nowhere. You can hear the buzz of insects outside, the endless wind. Inside, the tapper clicks steadily as it always does. But it's not just messages traveling through the copper veins of the empire, it's people. Their fears, habits, stories, and small stubborn hopes. Welcome to the unseen network that connected a continent long before radio towers dotted the skyline. The human side of a machine, A. It's easy to picture the telegraph as cold machinery, wires, batteries, and dots and dashes. But by the late 1800s, it had become deeply human. Telegraphists didn't just relay coded signals, they carried emotions across unimaginable distances. Messages were not all official business. Some were personal, painfully so. A short sequence of code might bear news of a family death, a marriage, a birth, a fever that wouldn't break. The operators transmitting these messages often knew the people involved. Towns were small. The sender might have passed the message through the telegraph window, eyes red. The recipient might be 3 stations down the line, waiting with dread. Messages were supposed to be read silently, relayed mechanically. But even in an age of stiff collars and buttoned-up propriety, grief leaked through. Rivalries, romance, and the odd duel. Telegraph stations were meant to be professional spaces, but human nature doesn't always cooperate. Some operators developed rivalries. Speed of transmission was a point of pride. There are reports of men competing to relay the fastest long-distance chess move. Others would tap out unkind nicknames or slightly delay competitors' signals, pretending it was interference. In one odd but documented case from the 1870s, a dispute over station performance led to an arranged duel conducted not with pistols, but with clapped fists and thick leather gloves behind the storage shed. The cause? A sarcastic message passed in Morse that translated to, "Tell your camel he types faster than you." But there were also moments of connection. Two operators in different colonies, New South Wales and South Australia, passed coded poems to one another for months. When they finally met years later at a civil banquet, they married within the year. The wedding invitation, sent by telegraph, of course. Women in the wires. By the 1870s and 80s, women were increasingly employed as telegraphists, particularly in smaller rural towns and border stations. This was partly due to staffing shortages, but also because women were considered, somewhat condescendingly, to have light fingers and be patient with tedium. Despite societal restrictions, these women became integral to the system. Take Alice Gregory, stationed at Eucla on the Western Australian-South Australian border. She managed the station alone for 2 months during an outbreak of dengue fever. Not only did she relay messages tirelessly while sick, but she also kept meticulous weather logs, managed water rations, and negotiated a minor labor dispute, all while surviving on preserved peaches and boiled rice. Women were paid less, expected to leave upon marriage, and given smaller quarters, but many defied expectations. Some kept transmitting long after official hours, sneaking extra messages through for nearby miners or widowed farmers too embarrassed to dictate through a male clerk. One female operator, Eliza Reardon, was said to tap out lullabies in Morse for passing bush children whose parents camped near the station. They couldn't read the code, but the rhythm soothed them. The supply caravans. Life at a remote telegraph station depended on regular supply runs, and these were anything but simple. Supply teams used bullock drays, camels, and later even bicycles to cross the arid lands. These weren't just deliveries. They were miniature events. The arrival of supplies meant fresh news, new books, dry matches, preserved fruit, kerosene, sometimes even music sheets. It also meant gossip. A resupply man was a walking newspaper. He brought updates from distant cities, who had died, who had married, whether it had rained in Broken Hill. Telegraphists looked forward to these arrivals with the intensity of castaways awaiting a ship on the horizon. Letters were read and reread. Packages opened reverently. Even the tin in which tobacco came was saved, cleaned, and repurposed. A well-liked supply runner might be fed a dozen meals in a day as he moved from station to station. A disliked one might find his tools subtly tampered with. When the desert fought back, the land itself was always a character in these stories, and not always a benevolent one. Sandstorms tore up wires, termites ate posts from the inside out, flash floods swept away entire cabins. In 1889, a telegraph station near Alice Springs was nearly buried when a freak storm triggered a landslide. The operator at the time, a Mr. Dunn, tapped out a final emergency message before mud caved in the relay room. "Storm rising, cannot hold, save station records, tell Clara I tried." His assistant, a 17-year-old named Percy Jansen, was found 2 days later, clinging to a fence post and still holding a sodden logbook. Mr. Dunn was never found. The message, however, was preserved. "Tell Clara I tried" was inscribed on a brass plaque outside the rebuilt station. The rules no one followed. The telegraph service had strict regulations. No unofficial messages, no private gambling, no unsanctioned use of batteries for lighting or cooking. Yes, some tried. And yet, creativity flourished. Operators built stills out of condenser tubing. They grew onions indoors using leftover kerosene heat. One notorious telegraphist was caught making pressed flowers using Morse tape and the pages of discarded ledgers. Another devised a system for chilling beer using damp cloth, a ventilator, and a string pulley from the ceiling. This beer cradle became famous along the overland line. The point isn't that they were rule breakers. It's that they were survivors, adapting technology meant for empires to serve very human needs. Messages worth more than gold. In some regions, messages had more value than money. Miners would pay a telegraphist a portion of their gold findings just to get news of the markets. Landowners used it to time sheep sales. Even the bushrangers, the famed outlaws of the Australian wild, were said to monitor stations for news of troop movements. There are verified reports that some stations were held at gunpoint not for gold, but for a copy of a message intercepted mid-transmission. This made secrecy paramount. Codes were sometimes changed daily. Operators were required to destroy messages after transmission unless explicitly instructed to log them. And when faced with danger, their first duty was to disable the machine. Several times, telegraphists sent false messages to throw off bandits or rival bushranger gangs. In one case, an operator claimed a gold shipment was rerouted, deliberately misleading attackers. The shipment passed safely. The operator received an anonymous pouch of coins in return and a thank you note in elaborate copperplate handwriting. No signature. The line between silence and civilization. The telegraph line wasn't just a way to communicate. It was, in many ways, the line that separated isolation from civilization. To settlers, it was a lifeline. To colonial authorities, it was a tool of control. To the indigenous peoples, it was a scar across sacred ground. And to those who manned it, worn, blinking in the heat, tapping rhythmically in darkness, it was a strange mix of burden and belonging. Many operators never fully re-entered society. Even when they retired or moved back to cities, they struggled with noise, crowds, and the absence of routine. Some spent years sending phantom messages to no one, just to feel the rhythm of the line. Which leaves us with a question. Was the telegraph line a triumph of connection, or the beginning of a new kind of loneliness? You return once again to the warm, humming silence of a telegraph station. Dust clings to the shutters, and the only light comes from an oil lamp flickering in the corner. The sound is unmistakable, a rhythmic clatter, the language of dots and dashes, steady as a heartbeat. But in this final chapter of the telegraph's long whisper through the Australian outback, that heartbeat is beginning to slow. The empire evolves. By the 1890s, the Australian colonies were moving toward federation. Railways expanded, roads were carved through previously impenetrable terrain, and messages once exclusive to government and commercial entities became increasingly accessible to the public. The telegraph, once a modern miracle, began to show its age. Improvements in long-distance telephone technology hinted at a more fluid, spoken connection. Submarine cables carried messages across oceans, and cities built modern central post and telegraph offices. The men and women who had once been scattered like isolated stars across the interior now found themselves part of a broader, more interconnected society. But the remote stations, they didn't fade quickly. They lingered, stubborn and vital in their way. It took years, decades in some cases, before each one shut its doors. Some resisted to the end. The last taps. The story of the final years of the overland telegraph line isn't marked by fanfare. It is marked by small closures. A station decommissioned here. A supply route ceased there. At Charlotte Waters, a particularly isolated post in the Northern Territory, 2 telegraphists continued to man the station into the 1920s, despite almost no official messages coming through. Their transmissions were mostly weather reports and Morse updates sent to a nearby cattle station. Neither wished to leave. One of them, Frederick Fitz Blaine, wrote in a personal letter, "There are no more messages, and yet I listen. I've become so attuned to the sound that I think I hear it even in silence. It's like a second heartbeat." When Charlotte Waters finally closed, both men had to be escorted out by rail crew. One reportedly wept. The telegraph set was removed, the wires cut. The station fell into disrepair. Today, only the chimney remains. Telegraphists after the line. Some operators retrained as telephone exchange workers. Others, less adaptable, returned to small towns or took up farming, only to find that the silence of the soil was less comforting than the rhythm of the wire. There were few honors, no parades, no medals. The telegraphists of the Australian interior faded into obscurity, many dying in anonymity. Their journals, tools, and logbooks were often discarded or lost in storage sheds behind regional museums. And yet their impact was deep. They had connected a continent not through grand battles or political speeches, but through persistence, through quiet labor, through learning how to live with the desert, the darkness, and themselves. The architecture of solitude. Many of the old telegraph stations were repurposed as police outposts, railway buildings, or homes. Others fell completely to ruin. But a few were preserved. At Alice Springs, the historic telegraph station remains a museum today. Inside, the original battery room still smells faintly of oil and copper. The keys are on display. The floorboards creak underfoot. You can walk through the operators' quarters and see where they ate, slept, waited. One room features framed Morse messages. Not dramatic ones, just day-to-day logs, supply orders, telegrams confirming safe arrivals. They are reminders that history is rarely forged in grand pronouncements. More often, it's built in these quiet exchanges. In the center of the exhibit, a plaque reads, "To the voices no one ever heard, but who spoke a continent into being." Whispers in modern times. Today, Morse code is nearly extinct, though enthusiasts still practice it as a kind of hobby. Satellites now carry trillions of bits of data each second. A single modern email transmits more information than an entire day of telegraph messages in the 1870s. And yet, when disaster strikes, when floods isolate regions, or fire cuts off radio towers, it is often Morse operators who step in. Amateur radio clubs, still trained in the old ways, have helped in emergencies from the bushfires of 2019 to remote flooding in the north. The tapping lives on quietly like the desert wind. Lessons from the line. So what does this forgotten history offer us? It offers a glimpse into the sheer resilience of quiet people doing quiet things. The men and women of the telegraph didn't seek fame, they sought function. They built and maintained a thread of civilization across a vast, often indifferent land. They lived simply, worked hard, endured. Their boredom was their burden and their brilliance. They survived by routine, by structure, by patience. They were the first to learn that connection doesn't always mean presence, that communication is not always enough to cure loneliness, that sometimes the line can be open and still feel silent. Yet they tapped on, even when the world stopped listening. A final message. Let us leave this story where it began, beside a small wooden desk, a metal key resting under a weathered hand. The air is dry, the line is quiet. And then one last tap. Respect. Because even in the vast emptiness of the outback, someone once listened. You lie back against a stiff, straw-filled mattress. Your boots are still on. The smell of wet wool, stale beer, and someone else's tobacco hangs heavy in the room. It's the early 1850s, and you're in a Goldfields hotel in colonial Australia. Not quite a hotel, really. More like a loosely assembled pub with ambitions and paper-thin walls. Sleep doesn't come easy here, but it's where you rest because tomorrow the diggings await. But tonight, let's stay a while. The Boomtown Boom. In the 1850s, Australia's gold rush was more than a mad scramble for wealth. It was an unprecedented demographic and social shift. In just a few years, towns like Ballarat, Bendigo, and Castlemaine swelled from tiny settlements to bustling frontier communities. And wherever people gathered, they needed shelter, food, and more urgently drink. Enter the Bush Hotel. They went by many names: inns, public houses, boarding houses, grog tents, and more. Some were hastily erected from canvas and bark. Others, more permanent, were built from local stone or sawn timber, but all were driven by one principle: serve the rush. These were places of both hospitality and hustle where beer flowed freely, rules were loosely applied, and profit margins danced precariously between fortune and famine. Building a hotel in the dirt. Starting a hotel in the goldfields wasn't complicated. A plot of land, a handful of basic carpentry tools, and a license. The license, of course, was not always obtained before operation. A typical hotel structure in the early years was absurdly simple. Main room, bar, dining area, and social space all in one. Kitchen, usually a corrugated iron shed or lean-to, with an open fire pit. Sleeping quarters, rows of shared bunks or mattresses on the floor. Privy, a pit latrine out back if lucky. Roofs were often bark slabs or canvas tarpaulins, which leaked when it rained and roasted when it didn't. Furniture was rare. Tables might be planks laid across barrels. Chairs were a luxury, crates sufficed. Windows were either absent or covered in greased paper to keep out dust. There was no insulation, no flooring, and certainly no room service. But still they came, dozens, then hundreds. A bed to rent, not to own. Hotel rooms, when offered, were not what we'd consider private. More often it was just space, a narrow strip on a mattress, shared with strangers. Bed sharing wasn't seen as particularly scandalous. It was necessity. If you were particularly unlucky, you might be assigned what was known as a hot bunk, a bed rented in shifts, warm from the last occupant's body. The record for one such bunk in Castlemaine was 18 occupants over 24 hours. Bedding was rarely changed. Lice, fleas, and bedbugs were rampant. An entire side industry emerged around bed cleaning, though the results were questionable. Some proprietors simply aired bedding over fences and hoped for the best. One newspaper account from 1854 dryly noted, "The bedding at the Gold Digger's Rest resembled more a museum of entomology than a place of slumber." Still, a bed indoors was better than the open ground. The smell of the rush. To walk into a Goldfields hotel in the 1850s was to step into a riot of sensation. Smoke from cheap candles and damp firewood. Sweat from dozens of laborers in woolen clothing. Alcohol, rum, brandy, and vast rivers of rough colonial beer. Meat sometimes off, always overcooked. Boot polish, kerosene, leather mildew, sour linen. There was no plumbing. Washing happened in buckets or creeks. Soap was often homemade or absent entirely. And still these places were beloved, because they were alive, full of stories, songs, laughter, and the possibility of news. The barkeeper and the ledger. Behind every hotel was a barkeeper or proprietor, part businessperson, part peacemaker, part local authority. Often male, but not always. Many widows found economic independence by running boarding houses or inns, making more profit than they might have imagined possible back in England or Ireland. The barkeeper kept the most important object in the hotel, the ledger. Here names were written or guessed at, drinks tallied, debts tracked. Credit was common, especially among regulars who struck it rich and then poor again in quick succession. Reputation mattered. Those known to pay their tabs were treated with deference. Those who didn't, not so much. Favors were also tracked, help carrying supplies, sharing news from other towns, catching a thief. This informal economy of favors and drinks underpinned much of Goldfield society. Meals you could survive. Hotel food was not designed to delight, it was designed to fill. The standard fare. Boiled mutton, tough, fatty, and often stewed to oblivion. Bread or damper, usually dense, often scorched. Tea, black bitter, brewed in enormous kettles all day. Beer cloudy, often safer than water. Salt used liberally when available. Vegetables were rare, perishable, and costly. Tinned food from Europe or the US was considered a luxury. Occasionally, kangaroo or emu meat might appear, but these were more common in bush camps. Breakfast was often yesterday's stew reheated with bread. Dinner might be stew again, this time served with flour dumplings. Still, many came to associate the thick, greasy meals with comfort. After a long day on the diggings, even rancid mutton could feel like home. Beer before law. Alcohol was the social engine of Goldfields hotels. While temperance societies preached moderation in the cities, the frontier was wild. Beer was often brewed on-site or brought in barrels from regional breweries. Rum and gin were favorites too, though purity varied wildly. Some drinks were diluted with creek water, others enhanced with opium, tobacco juice, or famously turpentine, which caused blindness and death on more than one occasion. Hotels weren't just places to drink. They were legal zones. Colonial law allowed licensed hotels to act as sites of marriage, dispute resolution, and even minor courts. Many a local magistrate settled feuds over a tankard. The hotel was a parliament, a courtroom, a chapel, and sometimes a morgue. Music, misery, and midnights. Despite the conditions, or perhaps because of them, colonial Goldfields hotels were centers of community. Music spilled out from within fiddles, concertinas, spoons on bottles. Irish ballads mingled with English pub songs and improvised bush poetry. There were dance nights, sometimes with sheet music, sometimes with just stomping boots. Men danced with each other without shame. It was more about rhythm than romance. But there was sadness too. Letters from home read aloud by candlelight. Stories of children left behind. Broken men who dug for months and found only dirt. A hotel might be a place of laughter one night and weeping the next. The walls heard it all. The bedbugs bite back. By morning, the hotel looked different. Dew clung to the rafters. Drunks stirred in corners. The fire was down to cold embers. Someone was already boiling water in a dented kettle. And the bedbugs still biting. One account from 1856 described how patrons at a certain inn would sleep standing, leaning against posts, to avoid being feasted upon by creatures most unwelcome. By breakfast, another day began, another march to the claims. Another night would come and the hotel would fill again. These were not glamorous places, but they were necessary. And in their rough, loud, infested halls, the Goldfields learned what it meant to be Australian, rough-edged, resourceful, and oddly fond of discomfort. Yet one question lingers, still crawling through history like those ever-present bedbugs. Was it the gold they came for, or the sense of belonging they found by the firelight? You return to the Goldfields Hotel, but this time not as a guest. You're behind the bar now, chalking the day's prices on a soot-blackened board. Beer, 4 pence. A meal, 1 shilling. Bed negotiable. The sun has just set and the men are returning from the diggings tired, grimy, and hopeful. You're about to witness the hotel not as a place to rest, but as a machine of survival, trade, secrecy, and silent power. Let's open the door and walk deeper in. The business of bedlam. Hotels in the Goldfields were first and foremost businesses, and like any business in a boomtown, they ran on speed, improvisation, and constant adaptation. The margins were thin. A week of bad weather could ruin food stores. A broken shipment of rum could cripple the bar's takings. And if a rival hotel opened 2 blocks down, well, then came the battle of pricing, free beer tokens, and under-the-table loans. Behind the apparent chaos, most hoteliers ran remarkably efficient operations. Inventory logs, updated daily by hand, tracking everything from tobacco rolls to candles. Beer taps, often gravity-fed from barrels stored in the rafters, or a pit cooled with wet Hessian bags. Food preparation, a constant rotation of stew, and stew, with damper bread baked twice a day. Good hoteliers made money. Great ones made legends. But the line between profit and ruin was always precariously thin. The ledger of secrets. The hotel ledger was more than just a financial document. It was a record of trust, suspicion, and subtle manipulation. Credit lines weren't granted by score but by character. A man who tipped the cook might find himself allowed to overdraw. A miner who got into fights was often told, "Cash only, mate." The ledger tracked more than debts. It recorded. Aliases. Many miners went by false names to dodge debts or past crimes. Favors owed. Lending tools, helping with drunk patrons, even babysitting livestock. Room changes. Suspicious behavior, stolen goods, or guests quietly moved to the stable overnight. Some entries included curious notes like, "Mr. Birch paid up, left early, smelled like kerosene, watch chimney flue." Hoteliers, in a sense, were informal intelligence officers. They saw everything and wrote more than they admitted. Under the floorboards. Few know just how much of a Goldfields hotel existed below the surface. The crawl spaces beneath buildings were used for hiding contraband, smuggled liquor, stolen gold, banned playing cards, storing valuables. Miners too afraid to leave gold in tents sometimes paid hoteliers to hide it. Escape tunnels. Rare, but some hotels near policing outposts had exits out the back, especially those doubling as illegal gambling dens or brothels. There's one 1862 case in Ballarat where police found a ladder under the bar trapdoor leading to a dirt tunnel, which opened behind a bakery 30 meters away. Inside the tunnel, a barrel of gin, 3 hand-drawn playing card decks, and a pocket watch engraved to Clara with love. GC. That watch is now in the Bendigo Historical Museum. The role of the publican. To run a hotel in the Goldfields was to wear many hats. Barkeeper, pour drinks, listen to lies, smile through threats. Cook, boil water, keep stew from burning, chase off dogs from the back door. Referee, separate brawling guests, patch up cuts, eject repeat offenders. Accountant, balance ledgers by candlelight, measure stock by weight and intuition. Community anchor, host weddings, funerals, voting days, cricket club meetings. Some publicans even hosted inquests. In one case, a body found near the creek was brought to the local inn. The inquest was held in the dining room. The jury sat on beer crates. In the eyes of the law, the publican was responsible for everything that happened within the walls, including lost property, rowdy behavior, and noise complaints, even when walls were canvas. But few publicans got rich. Most broke, even sometimes less. Women in the hotel trade. While the frontier image often centers men, women were deeply present in the world of Goldfields hotels. Many ran establishments after their husbands died or disappeared. Some never had husbands to begin with. Others were former servants, widows, or savvy entrepreneurs who saw opportunity in chaos. Women hoteliers were known for enforcing discipline. Guests often behaved better under the firm stare of a woman than the fist of a man. Smarter bookkeeping. Records from Mary Healy's hotel in Clunes show detailed profit margins on every item from candles to cutlery. Negotiating. Women often had better luck striking supply deals, trading with hawkers and nearby farms. They endured much harassment, loneliness, grief, financial pressure. Yet they remained central pillars of their communities. Some even earned legendary status, like Ma Brodie of Sandhurst, whose funeral was said to stop the mine tram line for nearly a day. Boredom, games, and quiet revolutions. Hotels were places of noise but also of boredom. Miners spent hours waiting for shipments, rains to clear, or injuries to heal. To pass the time, hotels developed. Card tables, often illegal, always popular. Dice games, played in back corners, sometimes for food instead of money. Reading corners. Newspapers, penny novels, and tattered books passed from hand to hand. Interestingly, hotels were early libraries. Some even charged a few pence to borrow books, encouraging a strange form of bush literacy. One miner wrote in a letter, "Read Dickens by candlelight, cried when little Nell died, next morning struck gold." Hotels were also where labor discussions first formed. In hushed tones, over mugs of beer, workers whispered about wages, safety, and strikes. The seeds of Australian unionism often sprouted beside the stew pot. And then there were the bedbugs. Yes, again. Despite every attempt to clean, hotels were infested. Patrons would sleep with their boots on, cover themselves in flour or kerosene, smother bedding in eucalyptus oil, beat mattresses nightly with wooden paddles. Some hotels advertised bedbug-free rooms, usually a lie. Others leaned into it with humor. One sign outside a Ballarat in Reed: 3 beds to a room, bedbugs included at no extra charge. One notorious infestation in 1858 saw a full evacuation of a hotel after it was discovered that the walls themselves had been colonized by the creatures. The entire structure was burned to the ground ceremoniously. No guests were injured. The bedbugs, however, were not mourned. From frontier to fixture. As towns became cities and the gold rush slowed, many bush hotels faded. Some burned. Others were swallowed by new buildings. A few were absorbed into more modern hotels, their original structures hidden behind plaster and polished brass. But the legacy remained. The chaos, the comfort, the uncomfortable beds. They shaped an Australian identity that was less about riches and more about rough survival and a strange, communal warmth that came from shared hardship. Yet one mystery lingers under the floorboards. Were these places homes for the gold-hungry or havens for those seeking something steadier than luck? The sun is rising now, casting long, amber beams through the warped glass windows of a weather-beaten hotel. You hear the stirrings of life boots on floorboards, the scrape of a kettle, a cough from a hangovered miner. The night has passed again. Another chapter in the life of a colonial goldfields hotel, written in soot and sweat, in stew and in song. In this final part, we'll explore how these chaotic, creaking establishments evolved or didn't. We'll look at what they left behind, and how their slow disappearance tells us more about success than gold ever could. A gold rush without gold. Not everyone struck it rich in the diggings. In fact, most didn't. And for many, the hotel became a place of quiet defeat. It's estimated that 90% of hopeful miners left the goldfields poorer than they arrived. Their tools rusted, their backs broken, but at the hotel they still had a place to be seen. A mug of tea, a shared bed, a voice in the crowd. In this way, Goldfields hotels became sanctuaries of the unsuccessful. They didn't ask questions, they accepted credit for a while. They offered hot food even if bland, and more than anything they gave the illusion, however temporary, of normal life. A bench to sit on, a wall to lean against, a meal not eaten alone. The greatest luxury the hotels offered was not the beer or the bed, it was belonging. Hotels as institutions. As towns formalized, the ramshackle grog tents and rough shanties either closed or matured. Some hotels evolved into respectable institutions with polished floors, printed menus, and glass windows. A few hired pianists, others installed gas lighting. Some expanded into multi-story buildings with balconies and enclosed courtyards. By the 1880s, a respectable hotel might include a parlor for women and families, a smoking room for gentlemen, a dining room with tablecloths and set times, a cellar with imported spirits, private rooms with keys, though still thin-walled and prone to leaks. These were the precursors to the grand hotels of Federation-era Australia, but even in their refinement, they retained quirks. A bartender might still cook your meal. A guest might still share a room with two others, and you'd still hear Goldfield songs in the hall after dark. Respectability never fully replaced resourcefulness. Ghosts in the guest book. Many Goldfields hotels are now gone burned in fires, abandoned when mines dried up, or bulldozed for car parks and shopping centers. But their names live on in faded signage, scattered records, and oral history. The Royal Standard in Castlemaine once housed miners from over 14 countries. Its register reads like a history of the gold rush in microcosm. The Kangaroo Arms in Beechworth reportedly had the best lamb stew, but no verified recipe survives. The Red Dog in outside Ballarat burned to the ground after a thunderstorm in 1877. No one died, but a drunk miner allegedly shouted, "Even the bugs couldn't survive that heat." Guest books, when preserved, reveal an astonishing level of diversity. Chinese merchants, Irish rebels, runaway sailors, Swedish engineers, African laborers, and English clergymen, all sleeping under the same leaking roof. Hotels captured the messiness of a young nation becoming something new, not through elegant architecture or famous patrons, but through layers of ordinary lives pressed together in common need. Traditions that outlived the boom. Some traditions begun in those Goldfields pubs never quite died out. Shouting rounds, the custom of buying a round of drinks emphatically and without expectation has its roots in the camaraderie of the diggings. Tall tales, the bush yarn spun with humor and exaggeration, often began in the corner of a crowded bar where stories were currency. Pub games, from coin tosses to impromptu poetry duels, these informal competitions shaped Australian pub culture for generations. Even the language lingered. Expressions like "hit the frog and toad," "to leave" or "stone the crows," "surprise," were minted in the stew-thick air of hotel bars. The hotels became schools of vernacular, places where a mixed population forged a shared culture, one bedbug bite at a time. Publicans as unofficial historians. Few wrote down as much about daily life as hotel owners did because they had to. Logbooks, licenses, receipts, food deliveries, and drink orders were meticulously tracked. From these we learn what people could afford: beer, vegetables; what news mattered: gold prices, politics; what changed slowly: menus; and what didn't change at all: bedsheets. Publicans remembered their guests. They watched as boys turned into men, as fortunes were won and lost, as quiet old miners faded into corners and died without fanfare. They could tell you who had a limp from a collapsed shaft, who cried when mail arrived, who danced best, who vanished overnight. Their memories, though rarely recorded formally, were the record. The long fade into history. As the 20th century arrived, many of these hotels were renamed, rebuilt, or erased. Gold mining declined. New technologies replaced stagecoaches and candlelight. Pubs became cleaner, quieter. Health laws changed the menus. Lodgings became private, and the raucous, communal experience of Goldfields sleep slowly disappeared. But remnants endure. A bent nail where the stew pot once hung. A trapdoor in a modern cellar leading to nowhere. A logbook tucked in the archives of a regional museum, ink faded and pages foxed. And in the way Australians drink together, shout jokes across rooms, and tolerate discomfort with a laugh, the spirit of the Goldfields Hotel still flickers. Lessons from a leaky roof. What then do we learn from these loud, smelly, chaotic buildings? We learn that civilization is not built by grand cathedrals or sweeping laws alone. It is built in stew pots and shared beds, in ledgers and laughter, in arguments and after-dinner songs. We learn that belonging matters more than luxury, that comfort is often communal, that stories grow stronger when whispered in groups. The Goldfields hotels weren't just where people rested, they were where they remembered who they were, or imagined who they could be. Not bad for a place with lice in the walls and beer you could chew. And so the door closes. You step outside now. The hotel door swings shut behind you. The smell lingers, smoke, salt meat, and damp wood. A laugh echoes from inside. Somewhere a concertina begins to play. Tomorrow the diggings, but tonight you were home, even if the bedbugs thought so too. You lie on a rickety iron-framed bed, staring up at the ceiling. It's shimmering faintly in the low lamplight, a rippling surface of pressed tin sheets nailed in uneven rows. A gentle wind outside sets the panels rattling ever so slightly like a whisper in a tin can. It's the 1870s, and you're in a newly expanded Goldfields hotel. It's better than a tent, sure, but something about the room is unsettling. Why does this place feel wrong? The answer, as it turns out, lies in the walls, and the floors, and most famously the ceiling. A colony in a hurry. By the mid-19th century, Australia was a patchwork of exploding gold towns. Prosperity arrived overnight, and with it, the demand for more sophisticated permanent hotels. Gone were the days of bark and canvas lean-tos. In came stone, timber, iron, and tin. Local builders faced a strange paradox. Materials were expensive, labor was chaotic, and time was limited. So they improvised. Pressed tin ceilings shipped in from the United Kingdom, and the United States offered an attractive solution. They were light. They were fire-resistant. They were easily installed over existing rough timber or thatch. And most importantly, they looked fancy. For a few extra pounds, a backwater pub could suddenly appear continental. But while tin ceilings were meant to offer elegance, they delivered something else entirely, a maddening acoustic prison. The problem of sound. Tin ceilings don't absorb sound, they amplify it. In a hotel setting, this meant footsteps echoed like stomping boots in a war parade. Conversations above were audible below, sometimes word for word. Drunken singing became disembodied voices from above, unnerving and surreal. Arguments between guests traveled sideways through iron-sheeted walls and ceilings, turning private bickering into public theater. One visitor to a Goldfields hotel in 1878 wrote, "I believed myself haunted for near 3 hours, until I realized the voices were from the next room reciting a Shakespearean soliloquy while disrobing for sleep." The problem was widespread, and it wasn't just the ceilings. Many walls were also made from thin sheets of galvanized iron or timber slats, cheap, modular, easy to erect but terrible for privacy. The result? You could hear your neighbor's heartbeat if you listened hard enough. And in a world where public life was rough and tiring, the lack of silence became a torment. Architecture of anxiety. It wasn't long before these design flaws began to take a toll. Several colonial-era doctors and constables noted an increase in complaints of nervous irritability, sleeplessness, and even disorder of the mind among long-term hotel guests. These were often miners who, rather than living in the bush, opted for extended stays in town inns. The cause: repetitive noises and hyperawareness. The drip of a leaking tank echoing off iron roofs all night. The scrape of chairs 2 rooms away. The constant creak of foot traffic, bouncing off tin and through slatted wood. The rattle of wind against unsecured panels, a persistent soundtrack in every season. And then there were the mice. Rodents running across the ceiling or between floorboards created such racket in tin-lined buildings that several hotels took to keeping cats, specifically trained to sleep in the rafters. Innovation or insanity. Not everyone complained. Some hoteliers celebrated the sound travel. One establishment in Gulgong wired a bell system directly through the tin ceiling, so guests could signal the bar with a specific knock pattern. Another used the ceiling echo to call staff from the rear courtyard. But for guests trying to sleep, the rage was real. One gold miner, after several nights without rest in a tin-roofed room, reportedly climbed onto the bar, punched the ceiling with both fists and shouted, "Silence your soul above me, devil man, or I'll bring the roof down." Witnesses later confirmed the room above was empty at the time. A doctor in Bendigo wrote in 1882, "There is something about the reverberations of thin iron panels that unsettles the mind. My patients report dreams of mirrors falling, clocks ticking backward, and ceilings melting overhead." Modern psychologists might call this sound-induced paranoia, but at the time, it was just seen as another price of the colonial frontier. The tin that touched the world. Pressed metal wasn't just used in ceilings, it featured in bar fronts, dining room wainscoting, exterior signage, corrugated roofing, floor underlays, though this caused even more echo. Why? Because it was cheap, durable, and came in ornate designs. Roses, acanthus leaves, geometric grids. Even the humblest hotel could boast a ceiling worthy of a ballroom if you squinted past the stains. Some ceiling panels were even repurposed shipping crate lids, painted over to hide markings like soap, 45 kg, or Glasgow wire NAILS. They rattled just the same. The cold within. Tin ceilings also brought a temperature problem. In winter, they radiated cold downward. In summer, they baked the room from above. Guests often reported being too cold at night and too hot by morning, especially if they slept on upper floors. One miner in 1866 claimed his boots melted slightly after he left them under the bed near a sun-heated corner of tin siding. To solve this, some hotels layered calico cloth below the ceiling to dull the heat and soften the noise, but this quickly became a fire hazard. One inn in Castlemaine burned to the ground after a kitchen spark leapt upward through the calico canopy. And so guests sweated and shivered, swore and scratched, but they stayed. Because even in tin-roofed torment, the Goldfields Hotel was better than the bush. Not just a quirk. The widespread use of tin ceilings in Australia wasn't simply poor planning. It was an architectural compromise, a balance between cost, speed, fashion, and necessity. But in choosing form over comfort, these ceilings came to symbolize a deeper tension in colonial life. The desire to appear civilized, even when infrastructure lagged. The pressure to modernize, even when materials weren't suited to climate or context. The promise of elegance, delivered through industrial shortcuts. You can still see them in a few old hotels today, many repainted, some carefully restored. They're beautiful, but if you speak to older locals, some still remember the rattle, and they shudder just slightly. Because some echoes never really fade. And so, we end this first section with a question that lingers between the floorboards and tin tiles. When does comfort become a performance, and how long can people live in a place that won't let them sleep? It's midday now, the hotel is alive, boots scrape across the veranda, a glass smashes somewhere out of sight, the walls hum with voices and movement. You're not sleeping. No one sleeps at this hour. The tin ceiling above you seems to magnify the chaos. It's not just shelter anymore, it's a sounding board for civilization's clumsy rhythm. But how did we get here? Why did these tin-plated decisions persist so long? In this section, we follow the spread of this curious architectural affliction and the quiet war it waged against silence. Imported beauty, exported madness. The use of decorative pressed metal in colonial hotels was directly linked to industrial advances abroad. By the 1850s, factories in Liverpool, Manchester, and New York were mass-producing embossed tin panels. They were shipped flat-packed in crates and marketed as fireproof, washable, and resistant to termites, everything Australian builders needed. The Australian colonies, flush with gold and ambition, imported these panels by the ton. But there was a disconnect. What worked in the drawing rooms of Leeds didn't necessarily translate to the dusty verandas of Castlemaine. Pressed tin, though ornate and versatile, was rarely adapted to the Australian climate. which oscillated between scorching heat and bone-aching cold, and more critically, involved acoustic challenges unknown in denser European settings. As historian Dr. Layla Cartwright wrote in Building the Bush, 1946, the ceilings were designed to impress, not suppress sound. They echoed the ambition of the colonies and the voices of everyone who ever shouted under them. Corrugated roofs and colonial regret. Let's not forget the ceiling's cruel cousin, corrugated iron roofing. Lightweight and rust-resistant, it became the default material for pub roofs, but when paired with pressed tin interior ceilings, disaster. The combination created a two-layered amplification chamber. Rainfall, which might have been soothing on a shingle roof, became a thundering roar that drowned conversation and shook crockery. Many hotels came to dread the storms. Guests tried stuffing cloth or straw into ceiling joints to mute the sound. Publicans hung wet sacks from ceiling beams to absorb drips. None of it worked. The thunder remained. One publican in Clunes reputedly hung a sign behind the bar that read, "If you complain about the rain noise, kindly take it up with the clouds." The inmates start renovating. Not all guests accepted their echo chamber fate. In the 1880s, some enterprising long-term boarders began to DIY soundproof their rooms. Common techniques included nailing old carpet or wool sacks to the walls, stuffing sawdust into crawl spaces between floorboards, tacking up blankets and newspapers across the tin ceilings. None were particularly effective, but they gave guests a sense of control. More than one hotel owner began offering quiet rooms code for the rooms farthest from the bar, and preferably without adjoining stairwells. Some hotels even trialed canvas drop ceilings, suspended a few feet below the tin. They muffled the sound slightly but sagged in heat and occasionally caught fire from stray candle sparks. A hotel in Malden tried a different approach, stuffing straw between ceiling joists and the tin panels. It worked for a season until a mouse nest ignited from the chimney heat. The result: the hotel burned, the mouse survived. Ceiling fights and furniture feuds. As noise compounded, tempers frayed. Hotel records and local newspapers from the 1870s, 1890s reveal a rash of noise-related altercations, fights that broke out because of architectural friction. One guest smashed a broomstick through the ceiling to silence a snoring man above. It landed on the man's chest. Both were injured in the resulting scuffle. In Ballarat, a group of gamblers reportedly flooded the upstairs hallway with water to cool the floor, in retaliation for loud piano music below. Several hotels developed unofficial curfews where guests were encouraged to walk softly after 10 p.m., though enforcement was nonviolent and entirely ineffective. Publicans tried solutions, such as banning boots in upper rooms or lining ceilings with sackcloth, but cost and fire risk often halted such efforts. In the end, the problem was designed into the very bones of the building. Strange myths and superstitions. Over time, the peculiar noise behavior of tin-lined hotels gave rise to urban legends and superstitions. Some believed the ceilings talked back, attributing random knocks and squeaks to spirits or omens. There was a persistent rumor in regional Victoria that sleeping beneath a tin ceiling during a lightning storm would cause insomnia for life. One hotel guest in 1893 insisted he'd heard a Latin prayer repeated over and over through the ceiling while the bar was empty. These stories, of course, were more folklore than fact, but they reveal how deeply embedded the ceiling had become in the hotel's personality. Even the architecture felt alive, or at least possessed by the clamor of everyone who had ever passed through. When design meets desperation, some publicans finally snapped. Records from the Castlemaine licensing court in 1897 describe an innkeeper, known only as Mr. Watts, petitioning to remove all ceiling tin and replace with Hessian and lime plaster. He was denied, citing structural integrity. Watts responded by painting over the entire ceiling in thick black paint, hoping to dull the echo. Instead, it reflected heat and light in new, dizzying ways. Guests complained of nausea. The paint peeled in humid months, falling like black snow into people's soup. Within a year, the hotel was sold. This was the fate of many buildings of the era. Desperate attempts to retrofit comfort into structures never meant to last, or to shelter so many people for so long. A ceilingscape of class. One final wrinkle: ceilings became a social indicator. Pressed tin with floral patterns marked the upstairs rooms reserved for wealthier guests. Plain square panels or exposed rafters denoted lower-tier rooms, or those rented by the hour. The barroom ceiling was usually plain, dented, beer-stained and full of nails where hats were hung or messages carved. To know your ceiling was to know your place. Some guests upon arrival were shown their bed and immediately looked up. The ceiling stained, elegant, crude, cracked told them what sort of night they were about to have. So the question becomes not why these ceilings persisted. That much is clear: cost, convenience, colonial mimicry. But rather, what did it do to a person to live beneath one for weeks, months, even years? It's night again. You lie still in your narrow bed, the tin ceiling above catching the flicker of a dying candle. You can hear someone rolling over upstairs. Another guest coughs through the wall. A floorboard groans. The ceiling seems to stretch and breathe like a living thing, an iron sky just inches above your thoughts. It's just a building, you remind yourself. But like so many who slept under these ceilings, you're beginning to wonder. The quiet that never comes. Sleep was the holy grail of Goldfield's hotels, and the rarest commodity of all. Ceilings made of tin were part of the problem, but the deeper issue was one of design failure meeting psychological fatigue. Miners and travelers, already worn thin by physical exhaustion, entered rooms expecting rest. Instead, they found dripping water tracing rust stains, creaking roof panels contracting in cool air, insect wings brushing metal with unsettling amplification, the occasional possum on the roof sounding like burglars on tiptoe. The ceiling became a source of anticipatory dread. Guests feared the sounds before they happened. Some reported nightmares specifically about falling through the ceiling or becoming trapped inside it. It was not uncommon to find journal entries from the time nodding. No sleep again. The ceiling speaks in clicks, not words but intent. These weren't exaggerations. These were symptoms of what would now be called environmentally induced sleep deprivation. The wear and tear of tin. Time made things worse. Pressed metal rusted, buckled, and peeled. In the summer, ceiling panels would expand so forcefully that nails were pushed out of joists, causing sheets to sag or fall. One hotel in Heathcote had a ceiling collapse mid-breakfast. No one was hurt, but the sound was so loud. A nearby dray horse bolted and caused a minor stampede. Another in Beechworth reported guano buildup above the tin, sheeting from bats that had taken up residence between the ceiling and roof. Eventually, the weight broke through onto a billiards table during a Sunday match. The solution: most often to patch it and forget it. Maintenance was not prioritized. Money was better spent on beer and more beds. Ceilings, even failing ones, were mostly ignored until they couldn't be. A slow shift in thinking. By the early 1900s, architectural trends began to shift. Lath and plaster became affordable and more widely adopted. Acoustic dampening techniques were developed slowly and mostly in city hotels. And most significantly, guest expectations changed. No longer content with shelter alone, patrons demanded sleep, privacy, peace. The gold rush had ended, the frenzy cooled. In larger hotels, The tin ceilings were either covered with timber or removed entirely. Some were left intact but painted over in heavy matte colors to reduce reflection and heat. Others became fashionable again in a different context. In the 1910s and 20s, pressed metal returned in boutique cafes and suburban villas, no longer a tool of necessity, but of nostalgia. This time, the buildings were properly insulated. No more ceiling madness. What the ceilings saw. In truth, the ceilings weren't the villains. They were mirrors. They reflected what happened below. Arguments between failed prospectors. Quiet prayers from sick children. Marriage proposals murmured after midnight. Drunken songs sung in languages long forgotten. Deathbed whispers as fevers took hold in shared rooms. Pressed tin ceilings are history books written in dents and stains. If they could speak, they'd have more stories than the guests ever wrote down. And in that sense, they weren't flawed at all. They were just listening. Legacy and echo. So what became of those ceilings? Some were pulled down, sold, and recycled into shed walls and chicken coops. Others were left to rust in ghost hotels, their patterns softened by dust and light. A few survived intact in museums, restored pubs, and heritage buildings, shining softly with the same stubborn luster they had in 1873. Visitors today admire their craftsmanship. They rarely hear the echoes. They don't know what it was like to lie beneath one, night after night, waiting for silence that never came. They see only beauty. But maybe that's the final trick of the ceiling. What once drove men mad now draws tourists in. A closing reflection. The tin ceilings of colonial Australia are more than architectural curiosities. They are metaphors for the ambition of a young nation, for the compromises made in haste, for the dissonance between appearance and experience. They remind us that beauty and discomfort often share the same space, that shelter is not always rest, that silence is precious because it is so often broken. And perhaps, above all, they remind us that sometimes it's not the weight of the roof that presses down on you. It's the noise it keeps in. The hotel is warm tonight. Laughter spills from the bar, tankards thump against tables, cards flutter, dice clatter. The air is thick with tobacco smoke, overcooked meat, and something else tension. You feel it settle in like fog. A chair leg squeaks across the floor. Someone says the wrong thing in the wrong tone. And then a punch is thrown. But oddly, no brawl, no chaos. The man who was struck steadies himself, spits into a handkerchief, and nods. The bar quiets, the game resumes. No chairs are broken, no one is arrested. Welcome to the peculiar, gentlemanly world of the colonial Goldfields bar fight. The myth of mayhem. It's tempting to imagine Gold Rush era pubs as violent, lawless places where men smashed bottles over one another's heads nightly. But the truth is far more nuanced and oddly structured. While fights did occur and could be brutal, the majority were conducted with a strange civility, bound by unwritten rules, community expectation, and the invisible eyes of the publican. This wasn't anarchy, it was ritual. And it told you everything about status, survival, and social code in the Goldfields. When punching was preferable to shouting. First, let's understand why fights happened so often. Life in the Goldfields was isolating, thousands of miles from home, family, and familiarity. Frustrating, miners spent weeks working without results. Competitive, claims, women, lodging, and even bar stools were scarce. Unforgiving, bad news arrived slowly, but always arrived. Alcohol dulled the edge, but only just. And in that world, honor mattered more than gold. Words were sharp, but not always sufficient. A clean punch could end an argument faster and more respectfully than a shouting match. There were no courts for every minor insult, so men regulated each other. The unwritten rules of bar fights. These rules weren't posted on walls or whispered formally. They were understood. passed on through observation, experience, and subtle enforcement by the barkeep. No weapons. Fists only. Bringing a knife or pistol into a disagreement was considered cowardly and escalatory. It meant exile or worse. No striking a seated man. The challenged was allowed to stand first. Ambushing someone was frowned upon and marked you as dishonorable. No fighting the drunk or sick. Fighting someone too drunk to defend themselves wasn't considered a win, it was bullying. One-on-one. Bystanders were not to interfere unless one fighter broke the rules or the fight turned savage. No blows after a yield. If a man dropped to one knee, put up a hand, or turned his back, the fight ended. Continuing marked you as cruel and untrustworthy. Fights stayed outside the hotel walls. If things escalated, the barkeep might insist, take it out front. Damaging the premises could cost you access to lodging, meals, or even local standing. Apologies were respected. A clear, public apology could cancel a fight. Many confrontations ended with a handshake and a drink bought by the apologizer. The barman had final say. No one overruled the publican. His space, his rules. He might break up a fight by slamming a bottle on the bar and saying, "This is my table, not your battlefield." The role of the crowd. Bar fights were rarely private. The entire hotel bar acted as witness, jury, and referee. Men would sometimes place bets not on who would win, but on how many punches would be thrown. It was common to hear, "Let him sort it." He owes the man a clip for that remark. "Fair go, no kicking." "That's enough, Tom, he's done." Crowds self-regulated. If someone broke the rules, the group would step in not with violence but with disapproval and isolation. A man who broke the code found himself drinking alone, or not at all. The barkeeper's balancing act. The publican didn't want blood on the floor, but he also didn't want to lose business. So he did what many colonial hoteliers became famous for, managing tension with diplomacy and beer. Barkeepers redirected arguments before they boiled over. Assigned seating to keep known rivals apart. Watered down drinks for already agitated guests. Knew everyone's debts and threatened to void them if property was damaged. Offered cooling walks, a polite suggestion that a man go outside and breathe before returning. And when it was too late, the barman might keep a weighted glove or a knob-carry wooden club behind the counter not to punish, but to emphasize fairness if things got ugly. Famous fights and fabled feuds. Not every fight was minor. In 1863, two rival mine captains, John Keats and William Harland, fought for 12 minutes outside a hotel in Dalesford after a claim boundary dispute. Witnesses said both men removed their coats and vests, shook hands, and agreed to fight until the matter is satisfied. Neither man fell. At the end, bruised and bleeding, they shook hands again and reportedly partnered in business the next year. Another case in Clunes saw two men both in love with the same barmaid fight weekly, but always followed by a shared drink. As the barmaid later told a newspaper reporter, "They fought not to win me, but to prove they could. I married a tinsmith from Melbourne. They never forgave the peace." The quiet after the thump. After a fight, it was common to see the two men sit together again, bleeding perhaps, but settled. A bar fight was never just violence, it was a performance of masculinity, a negotiation of status, a clearing of the air. And more often than not, it worked. Bar fights were not always fair. They were not always necessary. But they were, strangely, a form of social communication, one with rules, consequences, and meaning. So we're left with a curious question, as we wipe the sweat from our brows and clean the blood from the sawdust-covered floorboards. Can a fight still be considered civil if both men understood and respected the rules? The sun has long since set, but the hotel's heart beats louder now, Boots clatter against the timber. Laughter is sharper. Every man is one drink closer to a decision he may or may not regret. A coin hits the bar top. A chair scrapes back. And with a slow, almost ritualistic grace, two men square up in the corner of the room, watched, measured, understood. They won't break chairs, they won't throw bottles, they'll throw words first, then fists, and then, if all goes well, a round of beer. This is the dance of a colonial bar fight. The drinking floor as social arena. In the Goldfields Hotel, the main barroom was more than a place for pints. It was a stage, a public arena of masculinity, negotiation, and peer judgment. The men who drank here were miners and drovers, railway workers and Chinese traders, bushrangers turned laborers, soldiers and poets, and sometimes men pretending to be more than they were. They all shared the same space, and that meant boundaries not written but worn into the floorboards by repetition. Certain bar corners became informal territories. The fireplace, reserved for older diggers or respected long-timers. The table near the window, often claimed by readers, clerks, or letter writers. The wet side of the bar, where heavy drinkers stood, elbows on timber. Back wall benches, for quiet men, gamblers, or recent arrivals with little to say. Step into the wrong space without earning it, expect a warning, sometimes verbal, sometimes not. The initiation punch. In many towns, first fights were expected. Not sought out but understood. A new arrival who spent too long talking about his past victories, family connections, or supposed gold finds might find himself corrected. A quick shove, a cracked lip, nothing too brutal, just a reminder. This ain't Sydney, mate. One 1855 letter from a storekeeper in Bendigo describes it like this. The new man talked about his fencing medals. Jim asked him for a demonstration. He obliged. The demonstration ended with his nose bloodied and a new respect for quiet. Once a man had taken a punch and stayed upright, he was often welcomed. Not because he won, but because he stood. Women and the watching crowd. Women were rarely directly involved in Goldfields Hotel fights, but their presence shaped everything. A man might behave better in front of the barmaid he fancied. Or he might pick a fight to impress her. A woman's laughter could end a dispute or inflame it. A woman's judgment, spoken or implied, was often more cutting than a fist. In fact, many public fights began not with insults, but with awkward attempts at flirtation, misread glances, or the clumsy defense of a woman's honor, even when she hadn't asked. Barmaids were especially vulnerable to this social theater. They navigated complex, volatile dynamics with remarkable skill. One barmaid in Ballarat, referred to only as Elsie of the Silver Tap, was known to end brewing fights by shouting, "You fight, you sleep outside with the pigs." And they listened. Because if Elsie stopped serving you, you didn't drink again for days. When things went wrong, not every fight ended in laughs and lagers. Some turned serious, bloody, or even lethal. While rare, these escalations usually involved weapons in violation of the rules, gang interference, particularly in areas with rival ethnic groups or mining factions, alcohol poisoning. Fights between extremely drunk individuals often ended messily. Historical records include court cases with tragic outcomes. In 1867, a man in Castlemaine died after a friendly fight resulted in a fall against a cast iron stove. In 1858, a disagreement between two men over horse theft led to a barroom stabbing in Malden. The killer fled, but was later captured due to his distinctive ear tattoo, a gambling chip. Publicans learned quickly to spot the signs of a fight going bad. Raised voices with no laughter. Packing rather than posturing. Hands below the waist, indicating a concealed weapon. And perhaps most tellingly, silence. If a crowd went quiet, it meant something serious was about to begin. The role of cultural code. Different cultural groups brought different expectations into the ring. Irish diggers preferred verbal battles, witty insults, and dramatic gestures before any blows. Englishmen often adopted a gentleman's bout attitude, seeking fairness and a clear winner. Chinese miners, rarely involved in barroom conflict, were sometimes targeted, but local Chinese communities enforced their own rules of restitution outside the hotel. German and Scandinavian workers were known for sudden bursts of temper, followed by equally sudden reconciliation. Despite these differences, most fights followed the same outcome pattern. One man yielded. The other helped him up. The publican made them shake hands. And someone bought the first round. It wasn't about defeating the other. It was about restoring the order of things. The morning after, bar fights often left behind more than bruises. Shirts torn at the collar, coins lost in the sawdust, a broken stool or spilled ink bottle, a silence between two men eating stew across the same table, not yet ready to nod. But more often than not, the damage was minimal. By breakfast, the men were back to drinking tea, chewing on dry damper, and speculating about the next gold strike. A black eye was just a reminder, like a handshake drawn with fists. And if you asked either man what the fight was about, he might shrug and say, "Forgot, mate, ask the ceiling, maybe it remembers." Bar fights weren't random acts of rage. They were part of a frontier society's attempt to make meaning out of conflict, to resolve without revenge, to settle without courtrooms, to punch just hard enough but not more. And yet, did these rituals truly resolve anything, or just delay the real reckoning that silence might have forced them to face? It's dawn now. The bar is quiet. The stools are overturned. A bit of dried blood on the floor, but no one will notice. It's hard to distinguish from the spilled gravy. The hotel groans as it stretches in the morning light. Last night's fighters sleep in opposite corners, snoring, bruised, and oddly peaceful. No police were called. No one was jailed. No stories were written except the ones that would be told and retold over breakfast stew. This was the Goldfields way. The philosophy of the fist. By now, it's clear that bar fights in colonial Australia were not the reckless, destructive barroom brawls of Hollywood films. They were rituals governed by honor, public decorum, cultural expectations, and the unspoken goal of resolution, not domination. Fighting wasn't about rage, it was about balance. A recalibration of respect between men who didn't trust courts, didn't trust politicians, and rarely trusted each other until they'd tested the boundaries. If it seems backward resolving disputes with fists, it's worth remembering that many of these men came from societies where their voice didn't matter. They had been poor laborers, escaped convicts, disenfranchised immigrants, runaways from war, famine, and economic collapse. In the barroom, they had a chance to declare themselves, not in speeches but in stance, in resilience, in the willingness to take a punch and still hold their ground. Brawling as bonding. One of the most curious outcomes of the Goldfields bar fight was how often it forged friendships. Two men might argue over a spilled drink, fight over it, then share a bunk that same night. A card game dispute might end in a bruised jaw and a lifelong business partnership. One publican noted that some of his most loyal customers were men who had once punched the daylight out of each other under his roof. In one Ballarat hotel, two former rivals who fought monthly eventually teamed up to write a musical comedy about Goldfield life. It was staged in the very bar where their first fight happened, using the same stool one of them had thrown years earlier as a prop. Fighting was not always the end of civility. Sometimes it was the beginning. When the rules broke. Of course, Rules only work when everyone agrees to follow them. By the 1880s, the gold rush had slowed. The frontier towns became more settled. Law enforcement grew more professional. Hotels were better lit, better staffed, and better furnished. But the fights didn't stop. What changed was how society viewed them. Newspapers began to condemn bar fights as signs of moral decay, particularly as towns sought to become cities. Publicans were fined for allowing altercations. Licenses were revoked, and slowly the code of the gentlemanly punch began to fray. Some reasons: increased policing meant more fear of legal consequences. Rising diversity of social class in towns made the old rules harder to enforce. Modern ideas of respectability discouraged even ritualized violence. Eventually, what had once been a socially acceptable adjustment of opinions became a criminal offense. But among old-timers, the rules still lived. One old miner, interviewed in 1921, recalled, "You could sort out anything with a straight jab and a square end. You'd wake up sore but settled. Now they sue each other, or worse, talk too much." Legacy in modern times. You might think these rules are gone, but walk into any rural Australian pub today, especially the ones with creaking floors and hoarse brasses on the wall, and you'll still find echoes of the old code. The man who says, "You all right, mate," before things escalate. The bartender who watches body language like a hawk. The unspoken rule that certain things, politics, football, families, are best left out of loud conversations. And if all else fails, the oldest tradition of all: shout him a beer and let it go. Because in the end, even in the fiercest brawl, the goal wasn't victory. It was equilibrium, a reflection beneath the bruises. What can we learn from this story of fists and ale, of jawlines and gentlemen's rules? That people in difficult, uncertain times create systems of order, even in chaos. That dignity can coexist with discomfort. That violence, while regrettable, can sometimes carry structure, meaning, and even forgiveness. And that survival on the frontier was about more than finding gold. It was about learning when to throw a punch and when to shake hands after. So next time you pass an old Australian pub with sagging verandas and a dusty mirror behind the bar, think about what it has witnessed. Not just fights, but resolutions and rules and relationships forged through one of history's strangest social rituals. Imagine you're a miner in 1854. You've struck no gold. You've got no coins in your pocket, no bank nearby, and no time to wait for the mail coach from Melbourne. You're hungry, tired, and in desperate need of a shovel yours snapped at the handle yesterday. So what do? You barter. Not with gold, because ironically, few miners carried it. Instead, you trade your boots, your watch, maybe even a promise to dig someone's claim tomorrow. You negotiate with stew, rum, or nails. You strike deals in whispers and handshakes, not ledgers. Welcome to the unspoken economy of the goldfields, where anything could be currency, except actual money. Gold dust without a bank. Let's begin with a contradiction. The gold rush brought millions of pounds worth of wealth into Australia, but the interior was largely without banks, standardized coinage, or even consistent access to scales. Why? Banks didn't exist in remote towns. Branches were city-based, and gold towns sprang up faster than infrastructure could catch up. Transporting gold was dangerous. Bushrangers often targeted shipments, and private guards were expensive. Miners didn't always trust banks. Many were immigrants who had watched financial systems collapse in Europe. So what did that mean? It meant currency was improvised, and the economy operated on trust, trade, and immediate need. What could be traded? Just about everything. Here are some of the most common bartering items in the mid-1800 Australian goldfields. 1. Tools. Picks, shovels, sieves, and wheelbarrows were traded or shared daily. Broken tools could be traded for repair, often in exchange for food or labor. A well-made cradle, used for gold washing, could be worth more than a week's wages. 2 food and rations. A slab of salted meat could get you 2 nights in a hotel. A jar of preserved peaches might earn a pickaxe. Fresh eggs were considered luxury currency, sometimes traded like gold. 3 clothing. Dry boots were valuable after rains. Warm coats in winter, even more so. Underclothes were rarely traded, though due to lice. 4 labor. I'll help dig your claim if you feed me for 3 days. You build my tent, I'll show you a nearby creek I heard is rich. This labor for goods exchange was so common it barely required negotiation. It was assumed. 5 whiskey and tobacco, especially imported or rare brands. A pipe of tobacco could buy a meal, a rumor, or an apology. The ledgerless economy. In pubs and supply tents, formal receipts were rare. Deals were tracked in memory or not at all. Some barkeepers kept chalkboards behind the bar, noting who owed what. Storekeepers wrote nicknames instead of legal names. Red Cap Tom, Polish Jack, Lefty. Disputes were settled socially, not legally. A man who failed to uphold a barter might be cut off from food, drink, or access to shared diggings. Reputation was credit. If you didn't keep your word, you didn't eat. The rise of promise notes. As towns grew slightly more organized, an informal version of IOUs emerged. These were handwritten notes acknowledging a debt. Owe 2 stews and 1 bottle of brown, will return with gold dust Saturday. W. Some hotels accepted these. Others refused. Too many were forged or never repaid. But in smaller pubs, they were a mark of social status, who trusted you enough to accept your word. Some promise notes became mini currencies passed from hand to hand, as value tokens. I can't pay, but I've got this note from Digger McNabb. You know he's good for it. In a strange way, reputation became paper. Chinese, Irish, and indigenous trade customs. Different groups brought different bartering traditions. Chinese miners often traded herbs, spices, and imported teas, items hard to find elsewhere. Irish immigrants relied heavily on labor sharing, often organized within clans or community groups. Indigenous Australians, who engaged in some trade with miners, were selective, offering knowledge of land or access to water in exchange for tools, tobacco, or cloth. But their barter system was based more on relationships than goods, and often misunderstood by settlers. This multicultural mishmash created a complex, flexible economy where language, trust, and mutual need dictated what something was worth. The hotel as exchange house. Hotels didn't just serve beer, they were miniature trade hubs. Publicans acted as middlemen, facilitating barters between miners. Allowed collateral deposits. Leave your shovel behind the bar until you pay. Stored gold dust in hidden compartments, sometimes under floorboards, often for a cut of the profit. Took cutlery, watches, or boots as payment. One documented case in Clunes describes a miner who paid for 5 days of lodging with a recipe for yeastless bread that later became a local staple. The publican sold the bread, the miner stayed warm, the economy spun on. What wasn't bartered? Interestingly, some things were rarely used as trade items. Letters from home were too personal. Books were shared, not traded. Most miners kept the few they had. Photographs were sacred, kept close, rarely offered. And women's items like hairbrushes, buttons, or scarves were never casually exchanged. They carried emotional and social significance. In short, items of the heart didn't have a price. As night falls again over the diggings, the lantern light flickers across a table where a miner negotiates with a hotelier. He's offering a week of fence mending, and a half sack of potatoes in exchange for lodging and a clean shirt. No coin changes hands, no paperwork is signed, but both men nod. The deal is made. So the question we must ask is this: when value isn't measured in money but in survival, effort, and need, does it bring us closer to fairness, or just another kind of poverty? The fire crackles in the hotel hearth. Around you, miners are counting not coins, but cans of beans, nights of labor, and borrowed shovels returned on time. Deals are struck in low voices over stew bowls. One man offers to chop firewood for 2 meals. Another trades a coil of rope for a night in the dry. It's not commerce in the formal sense, it's survival negotiation. And it's happening everywhere. This is the second layer of the goldfields economy, the social contract that held the frontier together long before the bank vaults arrived. A culture of practical worth. What was valuable in the goldfields wasn't gold dust itself, it was whatever could help you work, eat, or rest. A well-made wheelbarrow could earn you access to a more productive dig. A tent canvas in good condition could be split between 2 families. A barrel of nails might be more useful than a pouch of gold because it allowed you to build shelter. And this economy flowed 2 ways. Practical to practical. I'll trade you my lantern for your handcart. Practical for future promise. I'll repair your sluice box if you bring me a sack of flour by Friday. Many of these arrangements operated on pure trust and the fear of social shame. In small camps, reputation was currency with interest. Break your word once, and the entire town knew by nightfall. Gold dust as a bad currency. It seems strange, but many barters avoided using gold directly. Why? Difficult to weigh, no standardized scales in most bush hotels. Easily falsified, mixed with brass shavings or dusted lead. Dangerous to carry, flashing gold made you a target for bushrangers and con men. Publicans preferred objects. They could assess a pickaxe. They couldn't always trust a vial of shiny dust. One letter from an hotelier near Ararat states, "I'd rather take 3 pounds of bacon than a handful of dust. Bacon don't lie." The rise of the tool trade. There emerged a circular economy of tools. Miners who struck gold would upgrade, buying better picks, cradles, or carts. Their old tools were traded down to newer arrivals or passed along in barter. Some tools changed hands a dozen times before being retired or repurposed into tent frames or fence posts. Even damaged tools had value. Blacksmiths offered tool fixing for food deals. A broken spade handle might cost a mug of beer and a handful of nails to fix, and then it could be rebartered. In one notable case, a single shovel passed through 7 owners over 2 years. Each one scratched their initials into the blade. It was eventually framed and displayed in a Clunes hotel under the name. The common shovel. When services became currency. Barter wasn't just for goods, it thrived on skills. Examples. Cooking, a man who could boil decent stew without poisoning anyone was in high demand. Meals were traded for lodging or minor gold claims. Tent making, those with sewing skills could patch or even build canvas shelters, exchanging labor for tools, food, or help in the diggings. Message running, literate miners were often paid in meals to write and deliver letters, or read news aloud to others. The most unusual example comes from Creswick, where a man with a trained singing canary offered evening performances in return for bread. He never worked a dig, but ate well for nearly 2 years. Debt, desperation, and disappearing acts. Of course, the system wasn't perfect. Some barters failed. Food spoiled before a trade was completed, tools broke after one use, or agreements were forgotten in drink. Some men made promises they couldn't keep, offering labor and disappearing in the night. A few abused the system, becoming what were known as gleaners, living off scraps of others' generosity, giving nothing back. This created two tiers of reputation. The reliable men whose word was valued as much as gold. They could secure meals, tools, and even transport without coin. The liabilities, known cheats or chronic debtors, banned from certain hotels or barred from shared dig sites. In one gold camp, a chalkboard outside the hotel listed men not to be trusted. Harsh, yes, but in a barter economy, trust was as tangible as bread. The informal auctions. Every Saturday in some towns, miners gathered outside the hotel to auction off items they no longer needed. Tent poles, unused pans, hand-drawn maps rumored to point to good diggings, homemade boots, broken watch parts. Payment was rarely money you bid with. A week's labor, a few pounds of jerky, a bottle of patent medicine, a promise to cook supper for the seller's tent. And unlike formal auctions, no one shouted. Deals were whispered, arranged in pairs, and confirmed with a handshake. The hotel as trust bank. Let's return to the hotel, the heart of this barter system. It wasn't just a place to sleep or eat, it was the beating heart of the local economy. Publicans recorded debts and trade promises in chalk behind the bar. Barkeeps refereed barter disputes. You said you'd fix the wheelbarrow by Thursday. It's Saturday. Store cupboards sometimes held items in escrow, one miner, leaving his boots as collateral for another to borrow a shirt. A well-run hotel became a trust bank, the place where deals were made, stored, and remembered, not officially, but socially. As the sun dips below the trees, the barter continues. A man trades an hour's firewood for a bar of soap. Another negotiates for a second-hand tent. And inside the hotel, a publican sighs as he chalks yet another IOU, stew and shirt, repay Sunday. He's not a banker, but he holds more economic memory than anyone else on the gold fields. And so we ask, in a world where nothing had a fixed price, but everything had value, did the miners find freedom, or just another kind of chain? It's a chilly morning on the edge of Ballarat. A miner with no shirt trades a tin whistle and a dozen nails for a dry jacket. The jacket's owner takes the whistle to a publican, who accepts it in exchange for a night's sleep by the fire. By noon, the same whistle changes hands again, this time for a loaf of bread. Not one coin changes hands, and yet the economy churns. But how long can a system like this survive? In this final section, we explore the slow transition from a barter-based survival economy to a moneyed society, and what was gained or lost in the process. When coins returned. As goldfield towns matured, banks and currency began to trickle in. The Bank of New South Wales, and later other colonial banks, opened branches near major diggings. Government-appointed gold escorts made it safer to transport dust and nuggets. Private assiers popped up, converting raw gold into coin for a cut. But many miners didn't immediately trust these new institutions. "I'd rather trade boots with Mick than trust a man in a suit," wrote one miner in 1862. Still slowly, currency made inroads because paper and coin were lighter than barter. A man could carry 10 shillings in his pocket. He couldn't carry 5 cabbages, a shovel, and a promised note during a rainstorm. Hybrid systems. For a while, the economy became mixed. You might buy dinner with coins, but pay for laundry with tobacco. You might use a gold sovereign at the general store, but trade spare trousers for a hat at the pub. This hybrid approach suited many. It allowed for flexibility, but offered the security of formal currency when needed, especially for larger purchases. In fact, some items remained unpurchasable with money alone. Trust, directions to secret gold spots, access to protected springs or known cave shelters, a ride in someone's cart during a storm. These were still bought with favors, loyalty, or quiet barters over shared stew. Barter's slow decline. As infrastructure improved, more towns got post offices and rail connections. Uniform weights and measures were enforced by law. The police magistrates' court began resolving trade disputes with legal contracts. These changes made it easier to sue a man for breaking a deal, so fewer deals were done with a handshake. Paper replaced trust. Miners who clung to barter were increasingly seen as old-fashioned, backward, or simply too poor for the money economy. And so, barter faded not because it failed, but because bureaucracy replaced community memory. The legacy of the shovel economy. Yet the legacy lingers. Some remnants of goldfield barter culture persist today. In rural pubs, it's still common to say, "Put it on the slate," a memory of the chalkboard debts behind the bar. At country markets, trades still happen over handshakes, no receipts required. And in moments of emergency fire, flood, hardship, Australians often return to barter instinctively. Food for fuel, labor for shelter, neighbor helping neighbor. This speaks to a deeper truth about the shovel economy. It was built on interdependence, not independence. You could not dig, survive, and sleep alone for long. You needed others, and they needed you. The economics of need. Barter systems often emerge where cash fails in war zones, prisons, or places where formal systems break down. The Australian goldfields were no exception. Barter was never a perfect solution. It was messy, unfair, and often favored the clever over the kind. But it worked because it was rooted in something deeper than economics. Necessity, community, and shared risk. One miner, looking back in 1901, put it plainly. "We didn't have money, but we had what we had. And what we had, we gave or swapped or lent. Because if you didn't, no one would do it for you when your time came." Final reflections, boots, bread, and barrels. Imagine this. A man stumbles into a Goldfields hotel after weeks lost in the bush. He has nothing, just blisters and a broken spade. He's given stew by a stranger, a shirt from the barmaid's brother, a place to sleep in the wood store. No one asks for money, but a quiet expectation forms. When you're back on your feet, you'll do the same for someone else. This is the heart of the shovel economy, not fairness in numbers but fairness in turns, a social rhythm. And as we step away from that world and return to our own, surrounded by apps, balances, receipts, and interest rates, we might wonder, was a broken pick and a warm bowl more human than the swipe of a credit card? Imagine walking into a town of 10,000 men, many of them armed with picks, some drunk, most desperate, and being the only authority for 50 miles in any direction. You don't have a revolver, you don't have a backup squad, you don't even have a proper office. What you do have is a felt hat, a notebook, a well-used walking stick, and a reputation. This was the life of the Goldfields warden, a figure often forgotten in Australian history, but who shaped the lives of thousands without ever drawing a weapon. Who were the wardens? Goldfields wardens were government-appointed magistrates and administrators responsible for managing everything from claim disputes to riot prevention, land use, and even mail service delays. They were lawyers, former police officers, retired military men, occasionally clergymen or schoolmasters. What they had in common was a mix of patience, tact, and absolute personal endurance. Their job required them to walk, ride, or sometimes crawl across vast swaths of bush to deliver rulings or settle petty grievances before they became shovel fights. The tools of their trade. These wardens were not like the American Wild West sheriffs. They rarely carried firearms and most avoided uniforms. Instead, their tools were a walking stick, used for hiking through bushland, or occasionally knocking on doors and barrels to gather attention. A leather-bound field journal, to record names, notes, and informal judgments. a tin whistle or small bell, used to call meetings or signal their presence in camps. A pair of spectacles, essential for reading barely legible claim forms or hand-scrawled petitions. Most importantly, they carried authority, which wasn't enforced by weaponry but by community respect. Disputes great and small. A warden's daily life was an endless loop of grievances. He jumped my claim line by 2 feet. She's been selling watered-down flour and calling it bread. Their dog stole my dinner. He said I cheated at cribbage. Every complaint had to be written down, evaluated, and if serious enough sent by courier to the colonial magistrate in the nearest large town, often days away. Most were settled on the spot with statements like, "Return the stew or offer equal stew in kind," or "Fill in the latrine ditch you left open." Some wardens were beloved for their fairness. Others earned nicknames like Slow Hand or Sleepy Law because of their deliberate, meandering approach to decision-making. How they maintained order. Without jails or constables, wardens relied on a strange but effective toolkit. 1. Public shame. Posting names on community notice boards. John Purvis fined 2 days, stew, for public urination behind Miss Howard's bakery. 2. Community mediation. Bringing 2 sides together under the tent awning and letting them talk while the warden drank tea silently. 3. Temporary banishment. Ordering offenders to spend 7 nights in the tent camp at Mulligan's Gully, a sort of informal exile. 4. Service punishment. Requiring offenders to chop wood for the town's elderly, fix ditches, or patch tents for local widows. Rarely did they write official tickets or collect real fines. Instead, the warden's power was social orchestration, keeping tempers cool and trade moving. The warden's walk. Perhaps the most iconic image of the Goldfield warden was not at a desk, but on the track. Each week, wardens walked or rode miles to visit smaller camps and creek diggings, checking for illegal claim jumping, disputes over tents and boundary lines, reports of theft or fraud, disease outbreaks, bushranger sightings. They carried maps, lists of registered miners, and sometimes bundles of unread mail they delivered by hand. There are accounts of wardens walking 30-40 kilometers a day in heat and rain, their boots worn down to the nails. One such warden, Charles B., was known for whistling loudly as he entered each camp assigned to hide your still, clean your tent, and fix your boots before he arrived. When they failed, not every warden succeeded. Some were run out of town for siding too often with wealthy claim holders. Others simply disappeared lost in the bush, or victims of violence. There are even rumors, though unproven, of a warden being bribed with a gold nugget the size of a wombat, never to return. One Ballarat digger famously said, "Wardens are like wagons. If they're well greased and pointed downhill, they'll come. If not, best walk to Melbourne yourself." As the evening comes and the warden steps into the hotel, brushing dust off his coat, he doesn't ask for ale. He asks for names. Who's had trouble this week? Who's still arguing over a shared claim? And whose dog really did take that stew? He pulls out his leather notebook, licks his pencil, and begins to write. Not laws, but balance. So we ask, in a society without official courts, did the warden bring justice or simply delay the next fight? The year is 1856. A warden, sleeves rolled, sits beneath a gum tree outside a tent marked public notice. Before him, 2 sweaty men, one barefoot, the other angry. Between them lies a shovel with a bent handle and a muddy claim map sketched on paper torn from a shipping crate. The dispute. They both say they were there first. They both insist the other cross the boundary. Neither will leave. There is no court, no jury, no evidence beyond mud, bluster, and memory. But the warden will decide. not with a gavel but with a stub of pencil, a quiet voice, and a warning glance. The tent courtroom system. Warden justice was both informal and oddly ceremonial. Most disputes were handled in temporary open-air hearings, often held outside the largest hotel or the supply tent in town. A canvas flap might be lifted to create a shaded space. 3 stools, 2 crates, no bench, no dock. The format was simple. Both parties spoke. Any witnesses were called or made up their stories on the spot. The warden took notes in a small leather book. A ruling was delivered on the spot. If the dispute was over more than 1 ounce of gold, the warden would recommend formal proceedings in a colonial magistrate's court, which could take weeks to arrive. So most diggers preferred to accept the warden's decision, even if it was flawed. It was faster, cheaper, and local. Common disputes handled by wardens. Wardens saw a pattern in the chaos. Though violence was rare, tensions simmered constantly. Here were the top categories of complaints. 1. Claim jumping. Minors marking out overlapping ground. Others stealing into unattended claims. Some disputes even involved sabotage, filling rival cradles with rocks to break them. 2. Tent encroachment. Land was tight in towns like Beechworth. Some tents were relocated by a few feet during the night. One infamous case saw a miner shift his entire tent 3 feet closer to a pub's chimney for warmth. 3. Tool theft. Picks, pans, and axes regularly went missing. Accused parties often claimed, "It looked like mine." Witnesses were unreliable, especially after a few drinks. 4. Water access. Streams were vital for gold washing. Disputes over upstream usage could shut down entire claims. Wardens often had to assign water rights informally, drawing lots or alternating days. 5. Unruly behavior. Drunken threats. Public urination. Diggers singing loudly past midnight, especially in multiple languages. Many offenses would be minor today, but in a lawless camp, they threatened the fragile social peace. Creative sentencing. Wardens, without jails or police enforcement, turned to alternative penalties. 8. Public notices. Nailed to trees or posts, these served as warnings. Let it be known, Samuel Hughes has been found in breach of gentleman's agreement. Trust with caution. 8. Labor assignments. You will build 2 privy pits for the community. You will wash dishes at the Braga Hotel for 1 week. You will repair the community footbridge using your own nails. 8. Symbolic restitution. In one recorded case, a man was ordered to give his boots to the injured party, then go barefoot for 3 days. 8. Social mediation. Occasionally, wardens invited both parties to share a meal after a dispute, sometimes paid for out of fines collected earlier. These resolutions were not about punishment. They were about balance, restoring trust with as little escalation as possible. Record keeping and the power of the notebook. Wardens' field journals became the only permanent legal record in many towns. Entries were written in type, slanted script with initials, dates, and sparse detail. Some journals were passed on when wardens retired or died. Others were lost to floods, fire, or indifference. In rare cases, wardens compiled monthly digests that were sent back to Melbourne, documenting the state of each district. 2. Disputes over creek access, one resolved by bucket exchange, one pending further rain. These notebooks are now historical treasures, tiny snapshots of bush society. The warden's role in gold licenses. Another of the warden's many hats, license enforcement. Every miner was required to hold a government-issued mining license. These cost 30 shillings a month, and many diggers saw them as unfair taxes. It was not the wardens, but troopers and police patrols, who conducted the infamous license hunts, including those that contributed to the Eureka Rebellion. Wardens often played mediator in these clashes. Some quietly warned miners when checks were coming. Others refused to report unpaid licenses, especially in hard winters. A few, sympathetic to the cause, resigned rather than enforce what they saw as unjust policies. Their actions helped prevent larger rebellions in other towns. When a warden died, when a warden passed away or disappeared, his belongings were inventoried. The most valuable item, always the journal. In one case near Castlemaine, the community buried a beloved warden under a large ironbark tree. His field book was sealed in wax and stored at the local hotel. A note beside it read, "Herein lies the truth, or near enough." As the candle burns low in the warden's tent, and the sounds of the camp settle into snoring and scattered coughs, he sits by the flap, notebook open. He writes, "Two men fought over stew today, neither at fault, resolved by mutual soup." And with that he closes the book, removes his spectacles, and waits for the next sunrise, when some other small injustice will require his quiet hand. So we wonder, was this slow, fragile system of justice more human, or just a delay before official law took hold? By the late 1860s, the goldfields began to resemble towns, not tents. Wooden post offices stood where once there had been stumps. Pubs were made of brick. Schools opened their doors. And in the middle of town squares across Victoria, tall buildings emerged, courthouses, with uniformed magistrates, typed documents, and clerks in stiff collars. The age of the walking-stick warden was ending. But for nearly 2 decades, it was his quiet justice, his steadiness, that held the gold towns together. In this final section, we look at the waning days of the warden, the rise of formal courts, and the legacy these men left behind. The arrival of the colonial legal system. As towns grew, so did the machinery of official justice. Courthouses were built in towns like Ballarat, Bendigo, Beechworth, and Maryborough. Resident magistrates were appointed, many trained in Sydney or London. Colonial police were expanded from mounted patrols into permanent town forces. These newcomers were often suspicious of the old wardens. Unrecorded decisions, undocumented fines, and verbal arbitration do not constitute enforceable law, wrote one legal reformer in 1871. And yet, in the absence of those things, justice had still functioned. Warden books were messy but respected. The new courts brought standardized procedure, penal codes, fees for filing disputes, enforceable rulings, and inevitably distance from the people. Wardens reassigned, retired, or removed. Some wardens were formally absorbed into the new system as clerks of the court. Others were reassigned to administrative posts in Melbourne. A few retired to nearby farms, often becoming unofficial town elders. And some simply walked away, disappearing back into the bush they had known so well. One former warden, known only as Mr. Bell, reportedly burned his journal in the fireplace of the Creswick Hotel the day the courthouse opened. "That's the end of that," he said. "Now they'll fight over the right kind of ink." The community's response. Not everyone welcomed the new legal regime. Miners accustomed to fast, local justice disliked the paperwork, fees, and delays of formal courts. Cases once settled in an afternoon under a canvas flap now took weeks. Witnesses were subpoenaed, depositions were taken. Lawyers once entirely absent became necessary intermediaries. Some diggers referred to the new courts as the cold tent. Justice still came, but without the warmth. In one small town, the local hotel continued to hold Warden Night every Thursday, where minor disputes were arbitrated in the old style by retired miners, for free. This lasted until 1894. Notable wardens and their tailies. While most wardens faded into anonymity, a few left behind legends. Receipt Warden Isaac Ferris served across 11 camps over 17 years. Known for solving claim disputes with rhyming couplets, which minors recited later at pubs. His notebook, preserved in the State Library of Victoria, is annotated in the margins with recipes and weather notes. Warden Eleanor Ellie Stokes, one of the only women to serve unofficially as a warden in the absence of her ailing brother. She resolved disputes from her camp chair, and once diffused a near riot by handing out loaves of bread and asking each man to sing a song before presenting his grievance. Her rulings were later recorded by diggers in a hand-bound book titled Miss Stokes' Book of Judgments and Buns. Candle the Wandering Warden of Omea, never officially named, appeared unannounced in times of tension. Known to settle disputes with a candle, whoever could blow it out from 10 feet away got the ruling. Believed to be a former naval officer turned bushman. What the wardens gave us. Though informal, wardens introduced foundational elements to frontier justice. Community-based mediation, non-monetary resolutions, service-based restitution, emphasis on reputational trust. These principles influenced rural arbitration traditions in Australia well into the 20th century. In many ways, they represent a kind of soft justice, not lesser than formal law but different in focus, keeping peace rather than enforcing punishment. Wardens in memory and monument. Today, you'll find few statues of wardens. But look closely. Some towns have streets named Warden's Walk or Ferris Track. Local museums in towns like Clunes and Daylesford often have replicas of wardens' notebooks, with penciled notes reading things like dispute over boots, resolved with soup and handshake. In Beechworth, an annual reenactment of a canvas court draws crowds every winter. 2 actors argue over a mislaid bucket, and an audience warden resolves the dispute. The judge bangs a wooden walking stick. The crowd cheers. As night falls on the quiet goldfields, the last candle is snuffed in the now empty warden's tent. His walking stick leans by the flap forgotten. But his notebook filled with odd rulings, human compromise, and muddy fingerprints remains. Not in museums, but in how we still settle disputes over fences, sheds, and borrowed ladders. Quietly, together,